Let me tell you a little bit about today's presenter. She's an agent for the University of Kentucky Extension Services. She's a graduate of University of Tennessee and Murray State with degrees in art education and horticulture, and she's a lifetime master gardener. Our guest today is Kathy Wimberley. Let's welcome Kathy. We're glad you're here today, Kathy.
I want to thank Bobby and Leslie and the McCracken County Library Service for helping me to share information about growing vegetables. I do hope that people, if they haven't grown vegetables before, will choose to maybe just start a few in small spaces this summer. The last frost should be on Sunday, Mother's Day, and maybe after that the soil will be warm enough to be able to go ahead and plant vegetables. So I'm going to give you some ideas. I hope to get you to go in your yard or on your patio even and grow some vegetables. So thank you for having me. I do have some internet service trouble here where I am, and it may fade out, but it'll come back on after just a little bit. So thank you much. Okay. Next, please. Okay, so this is the idea of what we're looking for as far as our bounty of vegetables. Just a wonderful chance to grow things in your backyard, maybe. Okay, so let's get started. It's a good thing to do this after the last frost. You will want to find a good location. You could determine the budget so you make sure that you can justify what you're doing. Decide what grows best at the site that you have and gather supplies that you need. Plant the plants or the seeds. Keep up the maintenance program and then harvest when everything is ripe. And we'll go over each one of these individually. So thank you. Next. Okay. So after the last frost, so we are anticipating that another frost is coming this weekend, which is very unusual for this time of the year. But when I first came to McCracken County, I was told that Mother's Day weekend was always the one chosen for the safest date of the last frost. And it looks like this year we're going to have that for sure. The other years I've been here for the past 10 years, there was a frost on May the 5th as the last frost, but most of the time the last frost is around the end of April. But it's good to know why we don't want to plant if there's a frost coming, because most of our vegetables are warm season plants, and the vegetable plant tissue will actually break down when it gets to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or below. So remember, that's when frost is possible. And typically the last frost date is late April, and there again, we are looking at Mother's Day weekend coming up. After this weekend, it should be safe to plant. The temperature of the soil is one reason that we want to make sure that we're not going to have frost as well, because cold soil, when it stays cold for long enough, the seeds can actually just rot if they're left in that cold soil without some nice warm temperatures to get them going. Okay, thank you. Next. So this is a picture of what frost looks like, and hope we won't see any this weekend, but that it is in the forecast. Thank you. Next. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is find a good location for the vegetable garden. You need to look and see if you can find a spot that is in full sun. And full sun is defined by 6 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. It needs to be a spot that's convenient to the people that are gardening. If it's, if they walk a mile to the garden, it's not going to be as easy to run out and grab a few leaves of lettuce or something like that for the supper table. It's a good idea to find a workable, well-drained soil if you're going to plant in the ground. Warm weather is needed for the warm season vegetables that we'll be talking about. A water source nearby is very helpful. In an average growing season, it starts to get very dry in the vegetable garden toward the end of July and August. Now, we have had years of exception since 2016 or so. Good air circulation is needed to have a good bountiful crop. Okay, thank you. Next. So there again, full sun is going to be 6 hours of direct sunlight, and you can look at the direct sunlight, hold out your hand. If it makes a really good shadow on the ground under your hand, then you're gonna, and the sun is beaming down your hand, that would be direct sunlight. Know that sunlight patterns change from spring to summer to fall. So what may be in full sun in the longest days of the year, which should be coming up in June, might actually be in part shade as it goes into August. So think about where the full sun is and how it could actually change to part shade by the end of the growing season. A way to determine that would be to look at trees and buildings, other structures, especially if they're on the south side of the site. The shadows are going to lengthen as the sun is going up higher in the sky until the first day of summer, and then it's going to start going back toward the south, causing the structures on the south side of the garden and trees on the south side of the garden to cast longer shadows, and those shadows will lengthen as the growing season goes into toward the fall. Thank you. Next. So this is what we would see in full sun. This is corn growing in full sun. And I thought this might be a good time to tell vegetable gardeners, if they don't already know, that if you're going to grow corn, especially sweet corn, this is what a lot of people really love to have in their garden. It needs to be planted in a block so that it makes a square. Wind pollinates the silks and drops the pollen onto the seeds. So what needs to be done is for that wind to be able to blow across a block and not just plant the corn in a long row. A long single row might cause poor germination, and that way you would have a corn cob but no real kernels of corn on it. Thank you. Next. So determine the budget. If people are going to have a vegetable garden, they can grow in their ground in the backyard or in their field close by. In-ground production is most likely going to be cheaper. If you're going to grow in the ground, in the soil that's there, we recommend a soil test, and that can be done at the extension office for a small fee. Right now the fee is $7, and it is possible to do a soil test. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Fertilizer, especially nitrogen, is going to be used by growing plants, and we use the letter capital N for nitrogen when we talk about the garden using fertilizer. So seeds are usually cheaper to use than transplants if you're wanting to think about keeping the cost down. Transplants are plants usually purchased in a 4-pack or a 6-pack at a garden center. Water hose will most likely to be needed for watering later in the growing season, when typically in regular growing seasons, the rainfall does slow down. Garden tools needed are a trowel, a hoe, a nice shovel, and maybe a rake. Keeping those tools sharp will help as well, and keeping them where they don't build up with soil. Wash them off after they've been used. You don't want to leave soil caked on the blade of the tools. And then garden gloves are helpful of, like, just make sure you don't get any stains on your hands. Okay, next. So planting in the ground is really good idea. If you have a space and you have, a good soil, it's going to be the cheaper choice. This is right up against the wall of a building, but this wall is on the north side of the garden. So the sunlight's going to always be able to hit right up against the building and continue to stay in full sun. This is a small space, but it can be very productive for such plants as an herb garden, right by the back door maybe. Thank you. Next. So determine the budget. Think about that growing from seed can save dollars. Such plants that can easily be grown in the garden from seed, that'd be preferable in some cases to grow from seed, would be corn, like sweet corn, garden beans, squash, zucchini, and watermelon. They're all easier to grow from seeds. Sometimes they're hard to grow from transplants. So if you purchase transplants, that can actually save time. Eggplant has a long growing season. It's an example of one that was very likely to be purchased as a transplant. The cabbages, that's a cool season crop. So could be that you're looking to start cabbage early on, but transplants for those are really good because they have a long growing season. Buying plants allows for an earlier harvest. Transplants are helpful if you're growing eggplant, tomatoes, and peppers, for example. Those are often found at the garden centers, and they do transplant easily. And soil testing is possible at the Extension Office, even though we're operating with limited public access right now. The soil test information and guides are located at the front door of the Extension Office in a box, so homeowners can bring in their soil, and we don't accept cash. It would need to be a check made out, and the directions are there, and it takes about 10 business days to get the information back on the soil. Our business for the McCracken County Extension Service is located at 2025 New Holt Road, and that is Paducah, Kentucky 42001. If you want to send anything there by regular mail as well. And our office number, if you need to call us and talk, we do have phone calls that are coming in, and we answer those. And the phone number is 270-554-9520. Thank you. Next. Okay, so this is an example of a seed packet. You can see that on the front, it's going to have a picture of what the harvest should look like. And it's going to tell on the front, you can see it tells how many days to harvest on this one. So the watermelon is going to be a rather long season, 85 days till it's from the time it's planted till the time you would have a watermelon to pick. And it will need a lot of space, so it's not something you grow easily in a small raised bed. But you can see on the back, it's going to have a lot of information about how many days to germinate, the planting depth, the days to harvest, and how to space the plants as you drop the seeds in. Okay, next. There again, this is the back of the packets, and also it's going to see, you're going to see the color map of telling about the zones. Right now we're in zone 7. That zone hardiness zone is determined by how cold it gets on an average winter. We used to be in zone 6B when I first started gardening many years ago, and it's switched to 7 now because it's gotten a little bit warmer. So that's the back of the packet's very important to be able to read before you even purchase it. That way you can know what you should be planning on. Next. There are organic seeds for people that want to have true organic production. So you would need to look for those that actually say organic on the packet if you wanted to grow completely organic. And it's just 2 schools of thought about, not saying everything has to be organic. It's just whatever the individual person that's growing the vegetable desires, if they want organic or just plain old vegetables like we get from the grocery. Okay, thank you. Next. So it's good to decide what grows best at the site. If the site is a small space, consider the mature size of the plant. For example, a watermelon or a pumpkin is one single hill of those is going to need a lot of space, maybe the size of a king-size bed just for one plant to have plenty of leaves. It's important for the plant to have enough leaves to be able to produce the right size of fruit, which is the melon or the pumpkin. So think about how big it is as the plants are mature. So that's why we want to have some really good spacing. So examples of smaller plants at mature size would be vegetables such as radishes. A mature radish or a mature carrot is only going to take up 6 square inches, something like that. So other plants for small spaces include onions, and onions are depending on the day length to produce, so you have to check on which kind of onions you want to grow. A lot of onions are actually cool season crops, and they're started in the winter. Lettuce can be grown in a small space, cabbage, green beans, and patio tomatoes, but you would want to limit maybe just 1 or 2 patio tomato plants if you have a very small space to garden in. So if you have plenty of space, kind of more like unlimited, where you want to be able to have a really big garden, sweet corn needs a good space. There again, don't think about growing a row of sweet corn. You want to grow a block of sweet corn. So like 6 plants by 6 plants or something like that. Cucumber needs a lot of space because they're going to need to have those long runners with lots of leaves. Now, some of these can actually be planted on a fence or planted next to a small type of fencing, so that you could actually train the runners to go up the fence and grow vertically. So you could have cucumber production growing vertically. It's hard to have watermelons growing vertically, but I've seen it done. They would plant the seeds and let the vines grow up, and then as the watermelons started to get heavy, they would tie a material around it, like pantyhose material, to help suspend that melon by tying that hammock type situation onto the fence itself and cradle the melon as it grew. Field peas really do need you need a lot of field peas to have a good amount of peas for your dinner table. So they would need more space. Okay, thank you. Next. Raised beds cost more, but they're really good to do if you can, because that way you are able to grow in a more convenient space. You're not disturbing the native soil, and you're going to know exactly what's in your grow bed. So the thing to think about is, if you can afford it, ProMix is a good thing to purchase, and ProMix is short for Professional Potting Mix. It's available at garden centers and farm supply stores. You just have to ask for the word potting mix, because it's going to be a soilless medium. So it's much more costly to grow with Professional Potting Mix, but it will last more than one growing season in most cases. So the extra expense to buying ProMix is justifiable due to some advantages. It has very good texture for the roots to grow in easily. Has very good drainage. It's going to be weed free from when you start out, instead of having your soil that has weeds in it. You're going to need to purchase a balanced fertilizer to add to that ProMix, because it's not going to have any fertilizer in it unless it says on the label that it already has fertilizer in it. The ProMix is not a true soil. It's called a soilless mix. It's going to be composed of organic materials like peat, perlite, vermiculite. Perlite's not organic, but it's going to have a very good component of workable material that will grow your crop very nicely. So the idea also about raised beds, if you have a raised bed, it's going to warm up quicker, which will be beneficial to early start. It's going to be easier to reach when people are actually growing the vegetables. And the raised bed could be created by making sides and then filling in the sides with the ProMix. The sides can be of plastic, lumber. Make sure the lumber is the right grade, not the old-fashioned pressure treated. Make sure it's not going to be harmful by leaching elements into the grow bed. There are types of metal that work very well for sides on a grow bed. And also, if you're careful and you gently push the ProMix together around the sides, or you can even use real soil for a raised bed. If you push it compact around the sides somewhat, if it's sloped gently enough, you can have a raised bed without any sides at all. Okay, next. So here's some examples of Professional Potting Mix. They can come in great big bags, and actually they're measured by cubic feet a lot of times, because the weight changes according to how much moisture might be in there. But this Professional Potting Mix was one that is doing very nicely to grow vegetables. Has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as a ratio of 3:15:28. It tells on the back of the bag. If you look at the upper, on the right bag, on the right picture, at the upper left corner of that picture, you're going to see that 3:15:28. That's called the blend, and that's going to be the fertilizer elements. And fertilizer is always listed in that order of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And plants are always going to need nitrogen, because nitrogen moves through the soil as the rainfall hits the soilless mix or the soil itself. Okay, thank you. Next. Tomatoes are a warm season vegetable, and tomatoes do nicely in structures that are called high tunnels. High tunnels can extend the growing season because they'll warm up earlier in the spring and then stay frost free until later in the fall. So they can really extend the growing season, and it could be just a very simple structure of a thin plastic supported where it won't touch the plants. But these were started in March of last year, so well underway by May. Okay, next. So remember, soil has requirements if you're going to use the real soil in the field or in the backyard. You want to make sure that there are no toxins present in the soil. You want to avoid heavy metals, and there are many heavy metals that can be taken up by the plants that are products of everyday living when human activity has been on the site. And I can tell you more about that if you need to know more about heavy metals. We have a lot of questions about that coming through the year. The soil does need to have good drainage. So after a heavy rainfall, if the gardener goes out and sees water puddles, which we call ponding, if they're ponding of water on the site and it doesn't drain away within 6 hours or so, then that doesn't sound like very good drainage. We want the soil to have good texture, and the texture is determined by the particles of sand, silt, and clay. And if sand, silt, and clay are in equal parts, that's a very good. That's a nice loam. To find out if the texture is ready for actually planting the vegetables or the vegetable seed, it's a good idea to do the squeeze test on the soil. So if you grab a handful of soil and you squeeze into a mass that's like a ball in your hand, and then you can take your other hand, one of the fingers of your other hand, and poke this little ball that you made, and it falls apart easily, then the structure is very good. Now, ProMix is always going to do this if you squeeze it into a ball, and you can always poke it. That's why the ProMix is always reliable, almost always reliable to not compact. So if it squeezes it won't fall apart when you touch it with your finger, then that's considered to be compacted soil. If people work up their vegetable garden soil when it's too wet and it doesn't pass the squeeze test, it can ruin the texture of the soil for the year, for the structure of the soil for the growing season. So it makes it very hard for the roots to get into the soil if it's ever compacted. And that compaction occurs when people work it when it's too wet. So I'm always trying to encourage gardeners to wait until the soil is dry enough. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, are needed by every plant. Those are the three most used elements every growing season. And there are more. There are actually like 18 to 20 minor elements that are needed as well. Most are always found in the garden soil. The soil test is going to tell if the soil needs phosphorus and potassium. And it's also going to tell the pH of the soil. And pH matters because if the pH is incorrect, then the fertilizer that's there cannot be taken up by the plant itself. So the pH for most garden growing most crops is around 6.5, and that can be determined by the professional soil testing from the Extension Service, and that's sent off to a lab and gets tested at the University of Kentucky. So there are kits that look at soil and give you a color range on a test strip or something that tells the pH. Those are not as reliable. It really would be good for people to know if their pH is correct, because a lot of money can be put into the garden in the form of fertilizer, but if the pH is off, then the plants just cannot use it. They call it unavailable. So that's why pH really does matter. The more acidic the soil is, the lower the number is. 3 would be very, very, very acidic. The vegetables that are mostly going to want 6.5. Blueberries are one of the free crops that we have that really likes acidic soil, likes it around 5.5. pH is hard to change if it's not close to what you really need at the site. It takes a good deal of time and to change soil pH in most cases. And also pH doesn't want to change. It has the soil itself has a resistance to change of pH. So that's a tricky thing. And there again, raised bed production with ProMix is helpful if the pH is off at the site. Nitrogen is almost always recommended because plants are going to need nitrogen to make those green leaves. Nitrogen moves through the soil. It's always going to need to be put on before planting if possible. The rainfall and irrigation are going to move that nitrogen that is applied down through the soil bit by bit by bit. The more water, the more it's going to move. And it actually can move all the way down past the area where roots are produced. So that's why we always are going to recommend using nitrogen. Now, legumes are going to be an example, like garden beans and peas. They're going to be able to take nitrogen from the air and take it down to the roots. So that's helpful. Okay, next. So this is how you can tell if you want to give this a little try out to see what kind of soil texture you have. The texture sand, silt, and clay. And so these are inexpensive containers. Purchased them at one of those dollar-only stores where everything is $1. And they have very straight sides. It's good to have the straight sides. So you put in some soil, like the middle picture, put in some soil, and then you fill it up above with water 2 or 3 inches, and you stir it in like you're making a milkshake. And then you set it somewhere where you can read it at eye level. As the layers form on the left, you're going to have banding. It's kind of hard to tell in this picture. So on the right, I did a diagram showing the colors of the bands on the left pictures, the left vase. So the bottom layer, that dark reddish brown, that would be the sand layer. And the next layer up is the silt. And then above that is the clay. The sand is the largest particle, so it's going to sink to the bottom. Silt is the next size particle. It's going to be the middle layer, and clay is very, very, very tiny. It's going to be suspended in water, so it's going to be hard to see as a layer, but that would be the clay is on top. Okay, so that's how you can do your own test at home to see what how close you have to silt loam or clay loam, things like that. So thank you. Nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You'll hear that over and over and over because those are the 3 most used elements. They're used in such a great deal more quantity than the minor elements. That's why they need to be present every growing season. Phosphorus and potassium, once they're there, don't move in the soil. So they're going to be available to the roots if the pH is correct. Organic matter is nice to add. It improves the soil in many ways. It's going to improve the drainage at the site. It's going to add pore spaces, P-O-R-E. Those little pore spaces are actually little pockets of oxygen and nitrogen, the atmosphere, carbon dioxide. They're little pockets of air, tiny spaces in the soil. The roots actually need oxygen to grow. So that's why we want to make sure we have pore spaces, and organic matter is going to be a way to improve those. When people work the garden soil, when it's too wet and it gets compacted, that pushes the soil close together where there are no pore spaces. Therefore, the roots have poor development in most cases. So slow release fertilizer should be added. If you can use slow release fertilizer, it costs more, but that way it's a one and done sort of a thing. And you can do that early on. And organic matter is going to actually add its own fertilizer. It's going to be a very low blend, like 2-2-2 or 1-2-1 or something like that. It's going to be very low in nutrients, but it's going to also be a very slow release. And it's going to help with adding organic matter is going to help with moisture retention in the dry months. So please remember to not use human waste as a fertilizer ever, ever, ever. And if you use animal waste, it has a very strict guidelines to be able to be used on a vegetable garden. It must be properly composted, and there's a definition for properly compost material, and I can get you those guidelines if you need those. Okay, next. Next. Okay, so this is in-ground production, and this is a tomato patch, and tomatoes are actually a vine, so they can actually be planted deeper when they're purchased than the soil that they come in, or the premix they come in. If you need to have, that way they can get a better root system started. But you can plant them a little bit deeper than they are, because they are a vine, and they do need support because they don't have a trunk or a stem, a main stem that's actually strong enough to hold up the tomato production. So this is trellising by using staking method to support these tomatoes, and they have really good production there. Next. Okay, so let's gather supplies for gardening. You're going to need your garden tools together. You're going to need seeds, transplants, fertilizer, a watering can, a water hose, and labels are good for your production. So you'll know what you planted in the way of seeds. It's hard to tell sometimes if which a squash, yellow squash, which was zucchini without proper labeling. Okay, next. Okay, so you can actually use disposable containers to grow even small space plants. You can not have to make a big fuss about gardening in some cases. These are the tall size coffee cups, and I punched a hole in the bottom. You can see on the left there. You could actually fill this within about 1 inch of the top with premix, and then plant a plant like basil, something small. The herbs would be small space, and you could actually grow them through the growing season in something like this. Next. So yeah, we gathered the supplies and we did that. Okay, nutrients we've done. Okay. Is there another slide? Okay. Okay, so plant some seeds. No, back the other one, please. The one before this one. Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. That's the one. Some plants may be grown from seeds. Plant the seeds at a correct depth. And if you don't know the correct depth, it should be on the seed packet. But if somebody gives you a package of their homegrown seeds that they're handed down in the family, a good rule of thumb is for a seed to be planted 3 times the diameter. So you determine the diameter of the seed and plant it 3 times that for the depth, and cover it nicely. Cover the seed after it's planted with soil or soilless medium. Some plants some of your growing may be from plants or as transplants. So if you have a transplant, use a trowel to dig the hole and plant it so the soil level is the same as in the packet came in, except tomatoes. That's about the only exception. You want to avoid voids, which would be large air pockets in the soil, by opening up the ground with the premix in your raised bed by filling with the trowel, and then nestling in the plant, and then gently returning those to the sides and pressing on the soil lightly. You don't want to press too hard because you can compact the soil or the grow medium to some degree, the grow medium. Okay, next. Okay, here's a picture of transplants, and this is for that big tomato production, so they have a lot of transplants. This big rectangle is called a flat. So instead of having the little individual 6-packs or 4-packs, they actually have a flat of tomatoes. Okay, next. So a good way to learn more about vegetable gardening, I always tell people this is like gardening from A to Z. Our vegetable gardening in Kentucky is kind of like a magazine. It's very, very thick, like a magazine. It's going to have all kinds of ideas for you to know about which plants to grow in small spaces, which plants need to be grown at what time of year, how to plant at the right time of year to have a fall garden, and It's going to identify diseases typical to certain plants and insects that you could look at for certain plants. So if you want to know more about growing asparagus, for example, in the back of this publication, it's going to have asparagus. It's going to have maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs just devoted to how to grow asparagus. So I encourage you to use this website to get the publication. And if you can't remember this link, you can go to the McCracken County Extension Services website, and the link is there as well. So the vegetable gardening in Kentucky, it's called ID 128, and it's one of the best I've ever seen anywhere in the nation. So I hope you encourage you to use that one. So if you really wanted to grow vegetables and you have a smaller vegetable in mind, you can take a milk jug, and I just used scissors and trimmed it down and punched a hole in the bottom. But this would hold about half of a cubic foot of Pro Mix, and you could grow a pepper plant in there, for example. If you like to have peppers, you could line up several of them on your patio if your patio's in full sun. If your patio's in a lot of shade, then you could actually grow lettuce in a container like this even. Just need to make sure it has a hole in the bottom for the water to drain through. So maintenance, after you've planted everything, you want to keep everything watered. You want to keep it weed free. You want to be mindful of herbicide use. Be sure if there's a herbicide used in a large garden, be sure you read and follow the label directions. The label is the law on any product that you use on any vegetable production. So you want to scout for insects and diseases. That means you're going to go around looking through the plants, pushing aside the leaf, looking down up and down the stem for diseases, insects, and turn the leaf over. Sometimes insects lay eggs on the underside of leaves. There are harmful insects and there are beneficial insects. So you don't just put out something that's going to kill all the insects, because ladybugs are an example of beneficial insects, and garden spiders are also beneficial. So remember, please, to read and follow label directions of any chemical that is applied to your garden. Thank you. Next. This is a picture of blossom end rot, and we see this a lot. Gardeners that are wondering what makes that bottom spot to kind of rot out. It's related to the amount of calcium and water taken up by the plant. So it's not just water and it's not just calcium, it's kind of a combination of both. But there are guidelines for helping with blossom end rot, and I can tell you more about that later. Thank you. Next. So it's time to harvest, and think about harvesting your vegetables when they're fully ripe. You want to store them properly until they're ready to be consumed. It's recommended to not refrigerate tomatoes because the cold temperatures of a refrigerator can cause the tomato tissue itself to collapse over time. And you could refrigerate them for a little while before you were going to slice them, but you don't want to store them in the refrigerator. So remember to, when you're growing your vegetables and it's time to harvest, just be sure you enjoy what you've done, because it's wonderful. Next. Here's a crop of green peppers, and as the green pepper gets really ripe, it's going to turn red. The bell peppers, I grew this on a pallet, just a wooden pallet with 2 bags of Pro Mix sitting on there, and just cut slits right in the Pro Mix, added slow release fertilizer, put in the transplants of peppers, and had quite a bounty. This is just off of 1 pallet, all that number of peppers. So it didn't take a lot. And this is what your harvest may look like if you get to go gardening this summer. So I hope you have a good time with your vegetable gardens. And thank you for inviting me to present. If you have any more need to find out more about what I spoke about today, these are 2 references with Kentucky Pest News, Planting a Vegetable Garden, along with the ID 128. So thank you very much. You have any questions, anybody?
I do have one. When is a good time to go ahead and move transplants if you grow them from seeds?
Well, the transplants are also going to be warm season vegetables in most cases, and they would also need to wait till after the last frost, which we hope is going to be Mother's Day weekend. There's only a 5% chance that we would even have frost on Mother's Day weekend in most years, but it's going to come this year according to the forecast. So it's tough this year.
All right, I've got one. Can people reach you via email if they have questions, or is calling best?
Oh, definitely email. I always, when I talk to somebody on the phone, I almost always get their email address because we have so many publications that support what I explain. So my email address is kind of short if you want to write it down. It's KAWI223@uky.edu.
Kathy, a great presentation. I have a quick question for you. With the predicted frost coming this weekend, do you have any tips on how people can cover up their plants that they've got growing now? What's some ideas?
Yes, covering up plants is going to be helpful if you've already started your vegetable garden. It's not recommended to use any plastic sheeting, even though that's cheap and easily to get. The plastic can do harm in some cases, so it's best to use cloth to cover, a thin cloth like the bed sheets are very nice. Something very gentle on the plants, and then to remove that as soon as you can after the sun starts coming up, after there's a frost.
I've also got 2 questions coming in. If you have a small balcony, would herbs be the only thing that you could grow?
Well, you could actually grow lettuce very easily. It's going to take, it depends on if the balcony has full sun on it or not, or just has 3 hours of direct sunlight. It depends on the site, but if direct sunlight is an issue, then there are lots of kinds of lettuces that do nicely and are easily to harvest. Some of the herbs might do okay, but I haven't had experience in growing herbs where there was a great deal of shade, but I can find out if you want to let me get back with that person.
Another question I've got, have there been any announcements or decisions around the county fair?
I've been in touch with the people that do put the county fair on, and they're supposed to hear something this week. So it's just like stay tuned. But we do have guidelines from the University of Kentucky, and I think that the guidelines I think are going to be that Extension will not be participating in county fairs this year. It's so risky to think about having people in a large crowd that soon, because our county fair is just a few weeks, 5 weeks away or so to start setting it up. So be patient. We already have the 2021 county fair planned for the horticulture entries, so that's good to know.
Looks like I've got one on, is there compost available at the city?
I heard some guidelines from on WPSD this morning about how that's going to play out. I would suggest calling them and asking them about that, about the availability. That, like I say, they have some new guidelines due to the COVID-19, but just need to make sure that if you have compost, that it depends on how you're going to use it, but a lot of compost has the chance of having pieces of walnut tree in them, like the twigs, the leaves, the bark, and there's a hormone in black walnut trees called juglone, and that is detrimental to most plants. So if a person were spending a lot of time on a vegetable garden and then they put compost on that had walnut residue in it, then they might end up defeating the purpose of being able to grow any vegetables on the site. And also, it's be sure that what you have does not have any heavy metals in it from, say, human activity often brings on heavy metals, and that's not good for a vegetable garden either. But you can always contact the City of Paducah, McCracken County, and ask them. They should have all the guidelines in place about how it can be used on vegetable gardens. I yield to their advice.
Do we have any more questions? Kathy, it's been a great privilege to have you today speak. We've all got so many great tips and tools and ready to plant our garden, especially once the frost passes. We look forward to other programs with you. The next program, as you can see on your screen, will be Grieving and Funerals in the Midst of the Coronavirus, and our guest will be Andrea Orr, owner of Milner & Orr. Kathy, thank you again so much for being here today.
Thanks to all of you.